Hello, this is the final video looking at how to answer questions on paper 3, Weimar and Nazi Germany. We've looked at 5 of the questions so far. This is looking at the final question, which is question 3D. Question 3D says, how far do you agree with the interpretations? Now, we're using the same interpretations we used in 3B and 3C. Of course, you've not forgotten them. We're going to use the same ones here again. So before we begin, just to let you know that spelling, punctuation and terminology using those correct historical words will be awarded marks. You can get up to 4 marks here. My advice would be, don't worry about it too much. Just write what you can, keep your usual style. Just keep an eye on things like capital H for Hitler, full stops and so on. So the question will look like this. It will say, how far do you agree with interpretation 2 about the reasons why? And then it will link into the inquiry, the same as 3B and 3C did. So in this case, we've been looking at Nazi support growing from 1929 to 1933. It will say, explain your answer using both interpretations. And I will put the word both in bold there like I have done. That's why you need to look at both. You will drop marks if you don't, and I'll come back and show how we'll do that. You also need to show your knowledge of the historical context. So what was life like at the time? We're going to bring in detail. This is worth 16 marks, and I would strongly advise giving at least 25 minutes to plan, which is key, and then write this answer. So, how do we answer this? What do we need to do? Well, the first thing is you need to pick detail from interpretation 2 you agree or disagree with, and use your own knowledge to back up your views. This is part of the planning stage. You then need to do the same for interpretation 1. Look through the interpretation, make a few notes. What do we agree with? What do we disagree with? You then need to explain in a conclusion which you agree with more and why. I'm going to plan and make these notes before you write anything down. So, the note making. Here's an example here. I've looked at interpretation 2 and I've just highlighted some points that I either agree with or I disagree with. And I'm going to bring these quotes into my answer. So I've got that line there, little support in Germany. The Nazis had very little support in Germany. And I'm going to say that I agree with that line. I agree with that statement. And I know, bringing my own knowledge, the 1928 elections, the Nazis got just 2.6% of the total vote. So that backs that line up. The interpretation also says that people were content with the Weimar Republic for a long period of time. And I would agree with that, and I know why, because of things like Stresemann's policies, the Dawes Plan, the Young Plan. They'd given Germany more status globally, things like being accepted into the League of Nations, of course. But there's some things I don't quite agree with here. The line says at the top there, it was a miracle Hitler needed to increase his support. And I'm going to say I disagree with that. That view is a bit too simplified for me personally. Even with the Wall Street crash, Hitler still needs an appeal to get votes. It's not just because of the Wall Street crash. Now, it's possible when you're going for the interpretations, you just find stuff that you agree with, and there's no disagreement there. And that's okay, you can mention that in your conclusion. I'm also doing the same for interpretation 1, so again, I'm at the planning stage here. I'm just underlining or highlighting some bits that I can bring out. So, interpretation 1 says the Nazis knew how to appeal to a wide range of people. I slightly disagree with that. They hadn't got that much support with these tactics before the crash. No one was really voting for the Nazis again before 1929. But they used the economic instability to appeal more to women, for example, and children after the Wall Street crash. The line says they made promises to different groups in Germany that helped get their votes. I agree with that. Groups like farmers, for example, they weren't voting for the Nazis before until Hitler convinced them they could keep their private land in the Nazi government. Therefore, in the 1930 election, 60% of the rural areas voted Nazi in some cases. Business owners as well were convinced to vote Nazi because of the threat of the communist vote, and people thought they might lose everything that they've got. But there's this line here that the speeches convinced many Germans the only future for Germany lay in the hands of Hitler. And I disagree. I think many Germans might be a bit of an exaggeration. For example, I know that more workers voted communist. The communists gained more votes during this time as well, and were seen as a huge threat to the Nazis. So, I've got my interpretation 1, I've got my interpretation 2 in my planning. I've just pulled out some detail. Before you start writing, decide now which interpretation you agree with more and why. There's no correct answer here. You're going to have lots of people who say they agree with interpretation 1, lots who say they agree with interpretation 2. Do not say you agree with both. They're two different points of view, so you can't agree with both. So I've just said, in this example, I think I'm agreeing more with interpretation 2. I think interpretation 1 might be a bit more simplified version of the past. Hitler's appeal was important. I'm not pretending it wasn't. But you've got to have the right situation for that appeal to work, which interpretation 2 says was more important. That Wall Street crash created the conditions for Hitler's support. So I need to write this up in an introduction. At the start, I'm showing my viewpoint straight away. I strongly agree with interpretation 2 about why Nazi support grew from 1929 to 1933. I feel interpretation 1 gives a more simplified version of the past and does not take into account the Nazis before the crash. I'll explain in this answer why I feel interpretation 2 was more accurate. I don't need to write too much here, but I'm setting the scene. If I don't get onto my conclusion, if I've done this at the start, it shows I've answered the question. It shows I will get marks for making a judgment. So in the first line, answer the question. Do you agree with interpretation 1 or do you disagree? Now, use an extent. If you can strongly agree or strongly disagree, it does make your work stand out. A lot of people will say I slightly or I partially agree, but don't force it. If you're not strongly agreeing, don't say strongly, just say partially. Okay, so we've analysed interpretation 1 and interpretation 2. We now need to put it into writing. We've done our notes. We now need to bring it to some paragraphs. Now, just a thing to bear in mind here is you must do both. If you only do one, you're leaving a lot of marks behind. Keep an eye on time here. My recommended structure would be make all the notes about interpretation 2 in one paragraph and then move on to interpretation 1 and do a conclusion. But if it's one of those rushed answers, we've got 10 minutes left. What you could do instead is you could analyse a bit of interpretation 2, what do you agree with or disagree with and why, move on to interpretation 1, what do you agree with and disagree with and why, and then move back and keep rotating. It's not as neat and clean cut, but you will get marks for looking at both. So, using our notes that we made, let's start writing that paragraph. So, just starting from the top, little support in Germany, and I would start like this. One reason why I agree with interpretation 2 is that it shows an understanding of the Nazis before the Wall Street crash. They say the Nazis had little support in Germany. I know this is correct, as in 1928 elections, the Nazis received just 2.6% of the total vote, showing that they were not attractive for people to vote for. Now I'm going to move on to the next point, continuing the same paragraph. They also say that people were content with the Weimar Republic. Again, I agree with this. Stresemann had boosted the public confidence in the Weimar Republic in the 1920s. The Dawes and the Young Plan had helped stabilise the German economy. The Locarno Pact and League of Nations had given Germany more credibility in the world. Therefore, moderate parties were getting more votes and extreme parties like the Nazis were losing support. And then my final point. However, I do disagree with one part of interpretation 2, where it says the crash was the miracle Hitler needed to increase his support. Whilst I believe the Wall Street crash was a turning point, I would argue this is too simple a view, and that Hitler still had to appeal to voters, as there would have been other parties hoping to take advantages of the weakness of the Weimar Republic. That's the sort of size you're looking for. I would recommend 3 points and that's it. But every time, pick a small quote and then back it up. What do you believe with? Let's do the same for interpretation 1 now. So, appealing to a wide range of people. Interpretation 1 says the Nazis knew how to appeal to a wide range of people. I slightly disagree with this. The Nazis did not have support from a range of people before the crash, mostly nationalists and right-wing supporters. This could be seen by a lack of support up to 1929. After the crash, I agree that they did use the economic instability to attract a wider range of groups, such as women, who were pressured to support men by voting Nazi, and children with promises of a brighter future. The next part is looking at different groups again. So I further agree where interpretation 1 states they made promises to different groups in Germany that would help them get their votes. I know, for example, that farmers were promised that they could keep their private lands. This led to a 60% increase in the Nazi vote in rural areas. Business owners increased their vote with promises of the businesses being protected against the communists. And then my final point where I'm going to disagree with this simplification. I disagree with the interpretation where it says they convinced many Germans that the only future for Germany lay in the hands of Hitler. I disagree with this, as I feel this is a simplistic statement. I know many workers in Germany voted for the communists at this time, and this was shown by their vote increase from 29 to 32. They were seen as a huge threat to the Nazis. So our paragraph would look like this, and when we bring our answer together so far, we've got an introduction, we've got 2 decent-sized paragraphs, we've analysed and brought in our own knowledge. The final thing we need is a conclusion. Just a word of caution with the conclusion, make sure it matches up with what you said at the start. So go back to the top, just double check, what did you say? Here I said, I strongly agree with interpretation 2. I need to make sure my conclusion matches that. So this is what I've written down. Overall, I strongly agree with interpretation 2 about why Nazi support grew from 1929 to 1933. I feel the Wall Street crash was the flashpoint needed to create the conditions for Nazism to be attractive in Germany. I do agree with some parts of interpretation 1, such as Hitler reaching out to different groups, but interpretation 1 does not take into account the lack of popularity of the Nazis before 1929, and oversimplifies the appeal of Hitler when I knew the range of people who did not believe in him. And if we add that to the bottom of our answer, this is what a model answer would look like. We've analysed both interpretations, we've reached a judgment and explained why, and we have consistently brought in our own knowledge. So, final thoughts on this one, just things to bear in mind. Firstly, leave enough time for this answer and to plan it out. Please, please, please do not leave it the last 10 minutes. It won't be a good quality answer. Analyse both interpretations. Don't just do interpretation 2. It says to do both. Make sure you do both. Leave time for this. Or rotate if you need to. Bring in precise own knowledge to state if something is true or if you don't agree with something. Don't just say, I agree or I know this is not correct. Bring in detail to back it up. Try not to get that detail from the sources. The sources B and C will talk about similar events at the time. Try not to just use that information. Your examiner will know exactly what's in those sources. Now think about the words used in the interpretation. Are they possibly exaggerations like we saw in this example? So if you think a word makes it sound unrealistic, you can highlight that and say, I don't think this is the case. I don't think, for example, it was all of Germany. I don't think it was all the Germans. I know these people didn't support Hitler. And finally, leave time for that conclusion. Make it clear which do you agree with more and why. It should match your answer as well. So, for example, if interpretation 1 you found 3 things you disagreed with it, don't then say at the end you strongly agree with interpretation 1 because clearly you don't, you strongly disagree. Okay, that's it for this video. Please make sure you leave enough time. Please do both interpretations. Please bring in that precise knowledge. Thanks everyone. Good luck.